First of all, thank you very much. We're very thankful with Katharina for your kind invitation. We're very grateful to be here. So as you said, we'll be talking about the case, very interesting case of Gabriel García Márquez. Last novel, well, actually the very word last is kind of polemic, so we'll discuss it throughout this presentation today. And we're looking at this ethics of dementia from a literary perspective, right? From a cultural, literary gerontology and age studies, broadly speaking, and also applying the lens of medical humanities. So yeah, we have to move to the next slide. Thank you so much. So as we mentioned, right, we are working with Katharina together on aging from different perspectives, applying this disciplinary frameworks, especially literary gerontology and medical humanities. We're moving towards this field now. So this is like a little bit like a plan for today, what we'll be talking about. I'll also talk a little bit about advanced directives, even if, of course, they do not relate, especially to literary field, because it's about more medical care in later life, but we'll just a little bit discuss it, how they might relate to the case of Garcia Marquez too. And also, I'll just start also talking about mediated paratext, and then Katharina will also take over and she will expand a little bit on this. Mainly, I'm pretty sure you're familiar, but in case not, just mediated paratext, which can kind of be divided into parts, which is epitext, which is everything that is external in terms of publication of a book. So, for example, interviews, reviews of a published work, social media posts, which is something that I'll discuss, and also the reception and the comments that the book receives at its publication. Whereas paratext is everything that is inside the book, and it's also very interesting, especially in the case of Garcia Marquez, because Katharina will also discuss it. It's about, what we find in apologia, what we find in footnotes, what we found about is like more internal writing. So we look at these two concepts in this broader aspect of the paratext. And also we'll discuss this very interesting and at the same time challenging interplay between a reader, which is us, how we read, how we approach it, how we approach the works being written by authors who are creating and living with dementia, and also in relation to literary criticism and also various stakeholders, like, for example, reception, literary critics, etc. So mainly our main question of today, and of course, very difficult answers, and we think that the answers will depend on each of us personally, depending on our values, depending on our perceptions. So we're just gonna kind of make this rhetorical or rather philosophical question, right? Is it correct? Is it good? Is it ethical? Because we're talking about the ethics of dementia, to publish, to edit, and to review a book, in the case of Garcia Marquez, and we'll discuss it briefly. Is it ethical, right, to publish something that the author who was living with dementia did not want that book, that particular work, to be published? So why we decided to focus on this case of Garcia Marquez? Well, mainly for two reasons. The first reason, because of course Garcia Marquez is a very internationally known writer. So when his last novella, or last work, so to say, was published last year in March 2024, social media sparkled all the comments and the different criticism about the reception, both positive, both negative. So it received a lot of social media attention. So it was also very polemic and very challenging and also very interesting. So we thought that's interesting because, this case raises a lot of ethical and even moral questions. And another kind of a broader perspective is that, as we know, we achieved this longevity revolution, which is a big achievement for humanity, right? We live longer, therefore, we also have more time to reflect on our life experiences, also to write about them. That's why there are more and more people writing into later life, right? And especially we have this memory boom, and people are reflecting on the aging experiences. And at the same time, by living longer, we also have this kind of disadvantage of developing, right, age-related challenges, illnesses, pathologies, and also difficulties. And one of them is, of course, dementia, right? The case of dementia are also increasing because people are also living longer. And at the same time, right, there are more people living longer and also documenting the dementia experiences, both from a third-person perspective. There are many, as you know, books that are reporting on caring for the parents who are living with dementia, or also caregivers. But also at the same time, there are more and more writers talking from a first-person perspective about how they experience this dementia journey. And this is also very interesting. We thought so this topic is very timely, very relevant, and actually there's going to be more and more cases in the future related to this, right? To this ethics in dementia, to the ethics in care and age studies in broader term, like in gerontological scholarship. So we thought that was also kind of first case, at least the first case that received so much international attention, of course, because García Márquez is a big name, right? But we thought that it's very interesting for future research too. Right, so maybe the next slide. Thank you. So I think this slide can also be even skipped because I mean everyone knows who García Márquez is, so at least someone read it, right? Yeah, you know that he's the writer, very famous, got a Nobel Prize, and also very famous for his book, right, The 100 Years of Solitude. That's also received another kind of polemic issue because, as you know, there's been also lots of debate whether to adopt it to a Netflix series, but that's another story. But also perhaps we can discuss it later if we have time after this presentation, because very much relates to what we've been talking about. All right, so as I was saying at the very beginning, right? So here we have this kind of existential question, to be or not to be, to publish or to destroy a book, right? So social media posts were saying, well, I mean, you should not publish a work of an author who did not want that work to be published. And some people regarded the publication of his novella as an act of betrayal, as disrespect for Gabriel García Márquez, kind of last wishes. Some also deemed it as kind of commercial opportunism and also some kind of, you know, looking for some kind of voyeurism or literary voyeurism or nostalgia. People also said that, you know, publishing something that was against the author's wishes would harm the reputation of this Nobel Prize laureate. So, but other voices were saying, well, you know, but that's something else that add to his literary legacy. And also perhaps we can see it as some kind of an action to immortalize the writer. So it's been very, very polemic, as I said. And of course, who is to decide? Perhaps that's the biggest question that we're trying to raise today. So a little bit of this background. If you're not familiar with that, so García Márquez during the last years, the 10 last years of his life, was living and working or trying to work with dementia, right? And then he finished this novella, which is Until August, or in Spanish it was published En agosto nos vemos. So he decided that this work does not adhere to his literary standards, and therefore he wanted this work to be destroyed or at least not to be published. But what happened? 10 years after his death, and also the date was chosen symbolically and also precisely just to mark the 97th birthday anniversary on the 6th of March in 2024. His last novella that García Márquez wanted to be destroyed was actually published and the decision was taken by Rodrigo and Gonzalo García Barcia, his two sons, who after their father's death became so-called literary heirs or literary executors or agents, right? Because they became responsible and also at the same time inherited this big kind of ethical and moral responsibility what to do, right, with all this legacy produced by their father. So as I said, the book was eventually published in Spanish 2024 and later on translated and published in English. So as you could see in a previous slide, we have these two books. And could you go back a little bit, Katharina, to the previous slide, because I forgot to say a very interesting thing. So you see, in the Spanish version, we have this kind of green, nice background. And what is interesting in the English version is you see these little letters that says The Lost Novel. So we thought it's also interesting in terms of this, you know, paratext, because what is a lost novel, right? So it kind of, these little letters also create this kind of sensation, what is lost, something that, you know, was lost and then it has been found So we thought that, these little details are also kind of creating this kind of sensationalism. And also at the same time, we might relate to this idea of lost narratives of dementia, right? That's something that there's lots of research done on that, right? Because when people can no longer tell these stories, they can no longer transmit these stories. So we talk about this lost narratives of dementia. So perhaps this lost might also relate to this idea of him living and creating with, this condition. So we thought that was also interesting. And also we can think about it as also one way kind of to sell the work, to kind of raise interest, and at the same time, it's kind of literary voyeurism to a certain extent. So yes, okay, we continue. Just spicing up a little bit the discussion. Okay, so a little bit, only one slide so that you know more or less the content, and hopefully we're gonna inspire you to read this novella, because first of all, it's very short. It's a page turner, and you can read it in a couple of days, because normally when you think about García Márquez works, it's like, big books. So it takes weeks to read them. Even, of course, it's an enjoyable experience, but in that case, this novel is very short. Of course, we're not gonna make it a spoiler. We're just gonna quickly, briefly give you kind of, a plot, what it is about. And we thought what is really interesting is that for the first time in his literary career, García Márquez is writing from a female point of view. Right? Because all the time, all his books were written from a male perspective. So this last novel, if you like, if you can call it last novel, right? Or lost novel. So it's written from a perspective of a middle-aged woman called Anna Magdalena Bach. And namely, the story goes like this, right? Every year in August, that's why the title of a novel is Until August, right? Or literally translated from Spanish, See You in August. So she travels every August from Bogota, from Colombia, to this unnamed imaginary Caribbean island. And what's the purpose of her trip? Well, is to lay flowers on her mother's grave. She's been doing it for many years, and she takes a boat from Bogota. She spends one night in a hotel. Next morning, she goes to the graveyard. She puts the flowers on her mother's grave, and then she returns to Bogota. But one time, right, one day in hot summer night in August, she meets someone in a hotel. And this meeting, right, becomes kind of this series of one-night stands that last for the next 4 years. Each time she goes to this unnamed Caribbean island, she meets a stranger at a hotel. She goes to different hotels, and then she has different stories that last 24 hours or so. So this turning point in her life also make her not only reconsider her marriage, right? But also make her think about herself as a middle-aged woman, right? She's experiencing this kind of midlife crisis. She is considering herself and her role as a wife, as a mother. They have 2 kids with her husband. She starts thinking about her femininity, about her sexuality, and also there's this increasing feeling of kind of loneliness. She's kind of, looking for this quest for self-fulfillment. She's starting to feel uneasy, and, she raises these existential questions of, okay, what's happening with my life, what I am doing, where I'm going, right? I'm aging. So this is a topic that we'll explore with Katharina in our upcoming next publication. We're very excited about it. We'll be looking throughout the perspective of female aging, and also in relation to travel writing, to this experience midlife crisis. So just a little bit bits and pieces of what we'll be talking about. And also very interesting, because if you read García Márquez, you know that he's always in his works giving us this kind of very subtle hints of, or if you read between the lines, right? Because what happens in this case with Anna Magdalena is, now that she is herself being unfaithful, she also starts to recognize and understand that her husband has also been unfaithful for her, because now she's behaving like this. So she understands, the signs, the symbols, and all the strategies, how to kind of, escape being caught. So that's also kind of again, saying that Gabriel García Márquez is giving us this very complex, interesting, and insightful psychological portrayal of his characters, which is also what defines his whole literary universe, right? This complexes about the human behavior and especially intimate relations. And of course, what is always part of his work is these little elements of magical realism, right? Because this is also what he's famous for. So just hopefully we spiced up your interest to read this novella. We're not gonna tell you how it finishes, whether there is a happy ending or there is not a very happy ending. And again, yeah, so this is more or less so that you know what the story is about, and we'll continue the next slide. All right, good. So let's go back to this question that we're raising today, right? This ethics in dementia writing in literary field. A little bit looking at this paratext, how Gabriel García Márquez was creating his last work. Well, as we said at the beginning, he was living with dementia for the last 10 years before his death at the age of 87. And in terms of this specific work, he produced numerous versions of it, up to 5 versions, because he was writing, he was stopping, he was rewriting. So he was never happy with the final product because also he was developing dementia, which also made it difficult for him to create. He would not maybe remember what he wrote, then he had to go back and then to rewrite it. So removing sentences, annotating in margins. There are lots of annotations if you look from his paratext perspective. And also what is interesting to mention is that destroying his own work was a very common practice in his literary career. So the fact that he wanted this last novel, if we call it like this, to be destroyed, this is not something extraordinary, because this is something that he used to do also with his other unfinished manuscripts or works that he was not happy with. And this is a very interesting quotation taken from an interview with Rodrigo, one of his elder sons, and this is what he says, you see in blue. If he had been in his full faculties, right, Garcia Marquez would have either kept working on it, we're talking about this particular novella, until August, and polished it, or destroyed it like he did with every other book. That was never. There were never any books around unfinished or unpublished. So, and this is very important what he's saying, to some extent, you know, we betrayed the writer. So we kind of accept that this has been an act of betrayal. And this is something that also been, you know, we have been accused of it in social media. It says, we betrayed the writer with diminished capacities to judge his own work. But there is also a but. He says, but on the other hand, he also used to say, well, when I'm dead, do whatever you want. So this is something that is very difficult to decide because, of course, then you say one thing, then Gabriel García Márquez was saying another thing, right? They say, but when I'm dead, I'm no longer seeing anything, so do whatever you want. And perhaps this idea, right, do whatever we want, you want, when I'm no longer here, was perhaps one of the reasons that, you know, kind of pushed the sons to decide finally to publish this unfinished work of the parent of the father. So initially, as I said at the beginning, this was supposed to be like a very big 600-700 pages novel with all the different interwoven storylines, but of course he was not able to finish it. Therefore, it is, we call it a novella, right? A short novel, page 10, and said 2-3 days, even less, you can read it. He was very excited about the creation of this work. And for example, in 1999, he read several passages from his work in progress in Madrid and also published some of the excerpts in a Spanish newspaper, a.r.t.e.s, the country, and also in the New Yorker. And then he stopped working on that, and then he moved to his really last novel. That's why we had this kind of, you know, polemic surrounding the word, like, what is his last novel? The novel that he published in his lifetime, and he agreed to be published, that would be officially this Memoirs of a Melancholy Horse that he published and wanted to be published in 2005, and then in English, in 2005 in English and a year ago in Spanish. And this novella, until August, is his last work. but it's not his last work because he did not want this work to be published, and it was published 10 years after his death, right? So while he was so enthusiastic about writing this novella until August, he also submitted the manuscript to Carmen Balcells, one of his editors, a Catalan editor, and then Balcells contacted Cristobal Pera, who finally also took over this manuscript. And if we move to the next slide, Pera reports back in his interview, says that he was talking to Gabriel García Márquez, and Gabriel was very excited, but at the same time, he was also showing some kind of hesitation because that, you know what, and here is a quotation, "At this point in my life, I don't need to publish anything else." He also felt tired. He was struggling a lot with dementia in his daily life and especially also in his creative activity. And, said, well, I'm already international writer. I don't have to prove anything. I'm just, I just don't need it. So we have this kind of, oscillating feelings of wanting this book to be out and also this book to be destroyed or unpublished, right? And another thing that García Márquez was saying a lot is like, just can't work without the most important tool. And what is that tool? It's a memory. And here you can see the quotation, a sort of material and my tool. Without it, there is nothing. Therefore, everything that I create, if there is no memory, it's not according to my literary standards. It's not me. I'm not expressing myself, right? Regarding dementia, of course, as he was growing older, dementia was also progressing, right? And he also struggled to maintain like conversations. He would not recognize his family members. With the only exception was his wife. And also, he would not even recognize his own work, right? He would take his own book and he would not know if this book was written by him. So what happened to these final versions of Until August? We have been taken and stored at the Harry Anston Center at University of Texas, Texas at Austin. And they stayed there. But then, of course, people had access to his works. And this is what Rodrigo is saying. He says like, well, someone published a couple of pages that they photographed from it, right? From one of these 5 versions. And someone also reproduced a page of the text, they copied by hand. So they said, well, people are using this work, people are reading it, people are investigating, people are researching, right? So says, well, perhaps we should also publish it because it's being used anyways, right? So it also has been like one of the decisions that helped them to make this final decision to publish or not to publish, right? So finally, we decided that a publication is worth to be, shared with a wider public. And then we decided, okay, so how do we do it? Because we have different versions. So we chose the one on which Gabriel García Márquez wrote the Gran OK Final. So we decided that Grand Final, right, would be like perhaps the most correct version out of all these 5 versions that he produced of this manuscript. And also we thought what's interesting, right? Because here we as readers are actively involved in this ethical decision-making, right? Whether it's correct or not correct to publish. And in the apology of the book, this is what the brothers say. Well, we decided to put the reader's pleasure ahead of all other considerations. If they are delighted, if we, readers, are delighted, well, maybe, possibly Gabo, García Márquez, might forgive us. So in this apology, what the sons are saying is this, that, well, we took a decision, but now it's for you, readers, to make another decision, whether what we did is ethically correct, whether it is an act of betrayal, whether we should be blamed for it or should be praised. So the responsibility now is being transferred for us readers. And in this context, right, we become this kind of active agents. And again, right, what is the correct answer? We do not have a correct answer. We may have our own answer because, again, the answer would depend perhaps on each of us, right, on our personal perspective towards this, right? And also, another kind of justification of publishing. They say that, well, from what I read, the readers can have a chance of enjoying his last work, like have one more work. If you like Garcia Marquez, so perhaps you want more of it. You just, can't kind of come to terms to the fact that he's no longer there, that he's no writing, and they're kind of using this metaphorical kind of saying, well, you have a chance to dance one more dance, to hear one more song, and also to hear one more poem from the writer. And again, in another interview, we are kind of repeating the same, right? That the audience will decide whether we children were wrong or not. All right, so a next slide. Okay, and finally, my last slide, and then Katharina will take over. As I said, we'll just talk very briefly about advanced directives, right? I'm pretty sure everyone knows, especially if you're doing research in dementia, right? Advanced directives are these written legal documents in which people living with dementia, right, we kind of decide how we want to be taken care, then perhaps we can no longer make rational decisions. So the next slide. Thank you. So how do advanced dementia, advanced directives, how do they relate to the case of Garcia Marquez? Well, actually, there is not much kind of, link to that, because advanced directives are about kind of, more medical perspective, how to take care in relation to healthcare, to decisions, right, to medicine. It's not related to the literary field, but we found kind of, parallelism between Garcia Marquez's final wishes of his work not to be published or to be destroyed, as also kind of, this final decision of what to do with his work, even it does not imply his health, right? And of course, the work was published 10 years after his death. I mean, it could not influence him whatsoever. So it does not affect, even if the work would have been published while he was alive and he was told that his work was published, perhaps it would have some kind of psychological impact, right? But we still thought that looking at this case of Garcia Marquez from this perspective of advanced directives is interesting, because it also raises these bigger ethical and moral questions that very much relate to the dignity, right? Not so much how we want to be taken care of in later life, but also going beyond this kind of medical perspective. What do we do with person's wishes, right? With a dignity, with respect, and in this case, very much relates to this literary ethics, right, of writing than living with dementia. And also people who are advocating for or against this advanced directive also say that, people change their opinions. Then you are at the early stages of dementia, or of the onset, when you have the onset of symptoms, right, you might decide that you want to perhaps be treated that way, and then you develop dementia, you change your perspective, because dementia is also progressing, it's all the time changing at the same time as aging, right? And of course, today, right, we in contemporary society, we have a fear of aging, and more than fear of aging, there is this fear of dementia, of losing losing one's mind. And we have also this very gothic, eerie, uncanny portrayals of dementia as kind of decline narrative, as something very dark, as kind of, these images of zombies, of living dead, that you are still alive, but you're no longer alive because you're losing your mind. So this kind of looks very scary, and also might also foster people to decide that, when they have dementia, they don't want to receive treatment. But also other scholars say, well, you do not know how you're gonna feel when you have dementia. Maybe you're gonna be living in a completely different and happy stage in your own kind of universe with no pain, and then of course it is perhaps not as frightening as it might seem if we look at this current cultural portrayals of dementia as this kind of threshold between life and death. So we thought that also it's interesting to look at this idea of advanced directives in the literary field. So I will leave now the second part of the presentation to my colleague Katharina, who will continue spicing up the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ieva. So you want to talk a little bit more about the ethics part, the post-mortem commercial ethics, to be more precise. As said, the publication of Until August has sparked significant controversy among literary critics on social media and also among readers. And one recurring concern was the risk for commercial exploitation of Garcia Marquez's legacy. In response to questions regarding the appropriateness of potentially profiting from the work by their father, one of his sons, Rodrigo García Barche, in an interview said the following. He said, here you can see it, he's here also on the slide. You know, if we wanted more fame and more exposure and more money, there are many easier ways to do it. You know, we have offers monthly to buy the rights of my father's books, short stories to make movies, series, operas, musical theater, podcasts, his life rights, the rights to his memoir. You know, it would be much easier for us to just sell and give interviews and be famous and rich in ways that are much less controversial than this one. You know, only a fool would do this for fame. Colombian novelist Héctor Abad, for instance, was one of those who were initially skeptical about the publication of Until August, yet revised his stance after reading an advance copy of the book. And he stated, I was afraid it might be an act of commercial opportunism. However, and no, it is quite the opposite. All the virtues that made the best Garcia Marquez great are also present here. Likewise, his son, Rodrigo García Barche, maintained that he did not think that the publication of Until August would tarnish the father's fame. As he stated, you know, I think wisely work is judged by artists, work is judged by their best work. This, as we clearly stated in the prologue of the book, is an unfinished book which has some delights and some interests and can incite some curiosity. Is this book going to jeopardize the reputation of 100 years of solitude? I'm quite sure it will not. A similar dynamic of profit-driven commercialization becomes evident in the case of the adaptation of Garcia Marquez's magical realist masterpiece, 100 Years of Solitude. Already mentioned here, Garcia Marquez had consistently resisted any cinematic adaptations of this novel, expressing doubts about the ability of conventional film structures to do justice to his work, and emphasized the importance of preserving the narrative in Spanish. Nevertheless, his sons contended that, to quote, in the current golden age of series, with the level of talented writing and directing, the cinematic quality of content and the acceptance by worldwide audiences of programs in foreign languages, the time could not be better. Accordingly, in 2019, it was announced that Netflix had acquired the rights to adapt the novel into a series. The publication of Garcia Marquez's last work, Until August, also complicates the widespread popularity and acclaim often granted to later life literary productions, which may be seen as a form of sensationalism, nostalgia, and positive ageism. In her article, When Old is New, Diana Athill and Literary Value, literary scholar Mary Eagleton explores how older age can be strategically framed as innovative and fresh within the literary marketplace. Focusing on Diana Athill, who you can see here on the slide, a British literary critic and writer who gained widespread recognition in older age, Mary Eagleton evaluates Athill's literary success and the extensive media attention paid to her later works. She considers the mediated paratext, so social media coverage, marketing, text by literary agents, reviews, newspaper articles, and so on, as central to the favorable positioning of Athill's late output. Notably, Eagleton also remarks, to quote, that the most striking feature of the Athill coverage is its repetition. Everyone mentions, as I have, her great age, the famous people she has known, her social background, and her sex life. For Athill to achieve a more lasting form of recognition, one grounded in aesthetic merit rather than biographical appeal, Eagleton argues that her work must undergo sustained critical evaluation. Literary critics, she suggests, are best placed to bestow the symbolic profits of esteem, recognition, and literary value. Eagleton's observation raises further questions. Should the literary work of individuals with dementia be subjected to critical review? Or do ethical considerations imply that such evaluation may be inappropriate, given the possible influence of cognitive decline on the creative process? And can conventional literary standards still be applied in such contexts, or must alternative criteria be developed? These reflections can be extended beyond dementia to include a wider range of conditions and life circumstances that shape or constrain an author's creative capacity. Eagleton further observes that, to quote, as the literary field repeatedly reproduces the dominant narrative, it is also desperate for novelty. In the case of García Márquez and Until August, this notion of novelty takes various forms. It surfaces in the repeated types of mediated paratext, in the apparent yearning to revive a literary icon, as well as in form of a literary voyeurism tinged with sensationalism and nostalgia. The processes of producing, publishing, and reading or receiving this novella, regardless of the conditions under which it was written, speak to a broader cultural appetite for finality, for novelty, and also for spectacle, so like a kind of yearning for melodrama. At the same time, these dynamics underscore the growing commodification and also commercialization of artistic legacy and later life creativity. Such tendencies mirror ideals of successful aging, which prioritize optimization, autonomy, productivity, and also self-management. Creativity under these conditions becomes a domain in which individuals are expected to continually display their achievements and productivity, regardless of age. The renewed focus on later life creativity is driven by efforts to promote social innovation and to cut public spending in a society that champions anti-aging cultures. Yet, Swinnen succinctly puts it, and he says we have to be careful not to instrumentalize to creative practices and uncritically incorporate them in neoliberal agendas that aim to encourage activity in older people to reduce healthcare costs. So do we have to condemn the publication of Until August, or can we also defend it? We are a little bit undecided, but we would say both. After all, one could argue that the decision to publish this book is an attempt to immortalize the writer's legacy, thus honoring his talent beyond the limitations imposed by dementia. Moreover, the usual stigma associated with aging and dementia is softened in his case, thanks to the author's celebrated international reputation. Even in an unfinished state, and despite his own apparent wish for the manuscript to be destroyed, his final work now forms part of a broader cultural heritage and literary canon for future generations. At the same time, it challenges ageist attitudes and the often negative connotations linked to dementia. Popular culture and social media play a pivotal role in shaping both public and academic understandings of aging and cognitive decline, influencing how we perceive, interact with, and value those living with such conditions. The publication of García Márquez's novella may thus help foster alternative narratives of aging and dementia framed through lenses of empowerment, diversity, and inclusion. The visibility of later works by authors experiencing cognitive impairment provides them with a platform that might otherwise be denied due to the persistent stigma surrounding dementia and later life. It ensures that their creative expressions and intellectual contributions remain acknowledged, even in the face of decline. What further adds to this notion is the book's annex, included in both the Spanish edition and the English version, and maybe also in other translations, but we have just worked with these two. Both editions feature peritextual materials consisting of in total 4 facsimile pages from the original Spanish manuscript, complete with handwritten corrections, annotations, and changes made by Gabriel García Márquez, as well as supplementing commentaries by the editor. These editions thus provide a transparent and intimate lens into the creative writing and editing process of a major world literary figure affected by dementia. It also insinuates that neurodegenerative conditions, especially in their early stages, do not necessarily mark the end of communication or even an author's literary career. Following this perspective, the book's annex, the paratext, may consequently be interpreted as an implicit form of dementia advocacy, testifying to the resilience of intellectual and creative output when living with dementia. Unlike other posthumous publications, such as, to give you just one example, the 2018 restored edition of Sylvia Plath's collection Ariel, the poetic collection, which supplements poem transcriptions with facsimiles of the complete original manuscript, the annex of Until August is deliberately selective. By limiting access to just 4 manuscript pages, the editorial decision signals a primarily illustrative purpose and reinforces the sense that a final, authoritative version of the work remains out of reach. This impression is further supported by the commentary that precedes the annex and the reproduction of a title page labeled version 5. You can see it here on top of the manuscript, which appears both as a facsimile and on the front flyleaf of the English edition, giving it a place of symbolic prominence. The decision to include only a few facsimiles invites a sense of intimacy between reader and text, a momentary, almost voyeuristic view into the creative mind of García Márquez. Simultaneously, the awareness that this posthumous insight was not selected or approved by the author, but editorially orchestrated, may lend the reading experience a museum-like quality. This curatorial effect is further heightened by the explicit reference to dementia in the emotionally charged opening line of the foreword, where it says, at the sons, "The memory loss our father suffered in his final years, as most people find easy to imagine, was extremely tough on all of us." From the very beginning, then, dementia becomes a lens through which the novella is read, implicitly inviting a symptom-focused interpretation of the narrative. Also, the novella's paratext therefore runs the risk of tipping into literary voyeurism, where the reader's gaze becomes entangled with an invasive curiosity about the author's cognitive state. Such editorial curation can blur the line between literary and autobiographical interpretation, prompting readers to search for traces of authenticity, self-disclosure, or private struggles of the writing process within the text itself. The ethical challenges accompanying this phenomenon can exemplarily be seen by the controversy surrounding the posthumous treatment of the life and work of the already mentioned American poet Sylvia Plath. When the BBC released the film Sylvia in 2009, the writer's daughter, Frida Hughes, raised sharp critique and, in her poem My Mother, defended her mother's legacy against exploitation, condemning the movie as voyeuristic. Hughes' response thus highlights the delicate balance between preserving an author's privacy and the public's desire to uncover intimate details, which poses a further ethical challenge regarding the treatment of works written by authors with dementia. In the case of Until August, one might ask what the facsimile extracts truly aim to convey, though. Are they meant to illuminate the author's creative process, or do they hint at cognitive decline, or maybe even both? No matter how one answers, engaging with literary works produced under the shadow of illness or disability raises unavoidable ethical questions. These include whether certain impairments, such as dementia, might impose a moral obligation to limit publication, whether by withholding the material entirely or by issuing it only in a carefully contextualized critical edition, in order to preserve an author's legacy with dignity and care. So in our approach, we have critically discussed the publishing history of García Márquez's posthumously released novella Until August through like an interdisciplinary connection of literary studies, the medical humanities, and aging studies. We approached the ethics of dementia by considering the role of literary advance directives, mediated paratext, the role of the reader, literary criticism, and the various agents involved in the publishing, editing, and reading of the scholarly reception of this work. So why did we choose this specific approach? Given the ethical challenges that arise when studying the work of writers with dementia, we made a rather conscious decision to avoid certain types of analysis and to focus on a different set of materials. Since this is a transdisciplinary network on dementia and aging, not everyone might be equally familiar with literary methods, so we thought it might be useful to just show you in the end here how our approach differs from a more conventional way of literary scholarship. So what might be helpful in this regard is to just give you a little overview, at least, of the different types of data or information that we usually use when we do literary research as literary scholars. And just to, it's a very heuristic overview. You usually have primary data, which means information that you can directly retrieve from a literary work, which includes both fictional literature like a novel, a poem, a play, and also non-fictional or factual literature like autobiographies and so on. And the information that you can gather here is usually something like content, style, structure, form, character, motive, and plot, and so on. Then you have secondary data, or secondary information, which includes information retrieved from scholarly literature, as well as paratexts. That is text that accompanies or contextualizes a work. And that can be paratext, which means text that is physically attached to the work, like a cover, genre label printed on the cover, a preface, and afterword facsimiles, and so on, and the epitext, which are external or surrounding texts like manuscript drafts, interviews, author diaries, publisher advertisements, reader responses in social media, and so on. And there is, last but not least, metadata, which consists of structured information such as bibliographic data, biographical data about the author, publication and reception data like sales figures, and so on. So when we usually think of literary studies, we often picture someone doing a motive analysis or character analysis or studying metaphors and so on. But as you may have noticed, none of that played a major role in our approach. So of course we read the book because we are literary scholars and we just love reading, but it's the plot or the imagery isn't really central to our analysis, to our approach. This is also why we have only given you a very short glimpse into the content of the book in order not to distract from the, for us, more fundamental question that guided our research, namely, should an author with dementia, should his work be published or not? What are the ethical implications when we publish such a book, especially when it comes to professional readers like a literary critic or literary scholar? So this is why we work primarily with secondary data. And of course, this is only one possible approach. There are many other ways to respond to these challenges. But what this case of García Márquez clearly shows is that literary studies need a shared conversation about how to navigate such ethical complexities. And what this whole situation reminded us of is a quote by American writer William Faulkner, who once said that a writer's only responsibility is to his art. He will be completely ruthless if he is a good one. If a writer has to rob his mother, he will not hesitate. So does this ruthless commitment also apply to publishers, to editors, to literary scholars and critics? Might it be said that a literary scholar's only responsibility lies with art? Could an editor justifiably adopt such an uncompromising stance? And can a literary heir, such as the brothers, the two sons, rob their own mother, or in this case, father, for the sake of literary greatness? As we would argue, working with text written by vulnerable authors, especially those living with neurodegenerative conditions, poses a range of complex ethical questions. Respect for authorial autonomy, analogous to patient autonomy in medical ethics, may also warrant application within literary studies. In this light, text written under conditions of illness or disability call for particular sensitivity and raise the broader question of whether cognitive impairment, such as dementia, should factor into publication decisions, or whether the writer's explicitly stated wishes ought to remain the sole guiding principle. Yet, ethical challenges are not confined to the publishing or reading of works of writers affected by dementia alone, but also extends to the treatment of, to give you a few examples, the work of authors affected by other works, forms of cognitive or linguistic impairment, such as, for example, aphasia, as in the case of Samuel Beckett or Thomas Tranströmer, as well as to those who, like Sylvia Plath, experience profound psychological distress. Similar dilemmas can also be relevant when considering the work of authors whose decision-making may have been influenced by substance use, as with Oscar Wilde, and opium use, or more broadly, the issue includes also how to approach unpublished manuscripts by writers in general. In this respect, García Márquez's case calls to mind other comparable scenarios in which posthumous publications raise questions like the case of Franz Kafka, who explicitly said that he does not want his later works to be published, like The Trial, The Castle in America, and Max Roth did so anyway. Similarly, Ernest Hemingway's literary legacy has suffered from questionable posthumous publications, some of which are widely regarded as inconsistent with the literary quality and stylistic integrity of his earlier celebrated works. The release of these incomplete texts has sparked ongoing debate about whether they should have seen the light of day or not. Notably, the ethical turn of the late 1980s and 90s, along with key figures such as Wayne C. Booth or J. Hillis Miller, or later also G. Thomas Kauser, spurred a growing awareness of the ethical dimensions of literary scholarship. Still, determining how best to engage with texts by vulnerable writers remains a pressing and unresolved issue. One contributing factor is that literary studies, unlike disciplines such as medicine, do not typically require formal ethical review before beginning research projects. The absence of such procedures, including ethic committees and review boards, may leave literary scholars without institutional guidance when working with sensitive material. However, introducing a form of preliminary ethical reflection or a more systematic engagement with ethical standards could better protect both subjects of analysis, the writer, and researchers themselves. It could also provide literary scholars with valuable guidance for the ethically sensitive handling of vulnerable authors. In any way, to come to our last slide, we are convinced that when it comes to dealing with the work of authors with dementia, linking literary studies with medical humanities and aging studies, as example of fields that inherently integrate ethical considerations into their theoretical and methodological approaches, also hold significant promise for developing more ethically attuned forms of literary scholarships. So thank you very much. Ieva, I think I show our last slides. And there you can also see our email addresses if you want to reach out and just stay in touch. We are really happy about that as well. Thank you.